As yoga teachers and spiritual leaders, when we work with students, what we're really doing is leading them through a ritual. Rituals have been a part of human culture since time immemorial, and they hold a very important place, not just in our development as human beings, but in our psychological health and well-being. Let's go through the elements and practice of ritual today in this podcast. Welcome to the Modern Mystics Podcast. I'm your host, Alana Kaivalya, the Yoga Doctor. I'm here to help you realize your potential as a spiritual leader and elevate your work in the realm of yoga, mysticism, and spirituality. This podcast covers all of our favorite topics: yoga, alchemy, astrology, divination, spirituality, psychology, ritual, and mystical practices, both ancient and modern. Get ready to up-level your status as a modern mystic. Ritual, as a word, usually brings up connotations of strange practices, things that are embedded in the occult, or deeply religious practices that perhaps we have some judgment about. I hope to turn that perception of ritual around today and diminish it altogether, if that is something that you feel when you hear the word ritual. Ritual is any kind of practice that helps to usher us from one state of being to another. But the elements of ritual are critical to understand so that you can move into this new state of being. Now, every single culture throughout history, in every single tradition, has had ritual. Ritual are some of the earliest things that we see when humanity organized itself into tribes. Ritual is an elevated way to behave or act in order to access something bigger or greater than ourselves, but it also brings us together as tribe members. Rituals hold communities together. They give us holidays. They give us rites of passage. Rituals are very important in every single society. Rituals have for a long time been associated, yes, with religious or spiritual practices, but they don't have to be. And one of the struggles that we have in this modern day age is a loss of ritual. In greater and greater numbers, we are walking away from our original religious or spiritual traditions. Now, this is something I talk about much more in podcast number 8. So if you want a little bit more background on why this is, or why more people are walking away from these traditions, or what that means for us, check out podcast number 8. But what we have is essentially this spiritual gap for modern day people. When we walk away from our native traditions, when we walk away from our native religious practice or spiritual practice, we usually also walk away from the rituals that are associated with it. And often we feel negativity toward ritual practice because we associate it specifically with our initial upbringing or any negative experience we may have had with that. This is very common. This may not be you. You may be stoked about ritual, so I don't want to speak for everybody, but if you work with students and clients, you may run into this. So it's important that you're aware that there's a bit of a stigma around the idea of ritual for many of us here in the West. Now, that's too bad because it doesn't have to be associated with a specific religion or a specific spirituality. And in fact, while it doesn't need to be associated with something, we still need to do it. Rituals are still so important for us. Now, let me talk about some of the rituals that perpetuate in modern Western society, regardless of the fact that we have walked away from religious or spiritual traditions. So whether or not we participate in religion or spirituality, we all know and understand, and many of us participate in wedding rituals. This is probably the most common one. And again, beyond any kind of religion, we still find our way through a wedding ritual, one way or the other. So if we think about it, and all of us, I'm hoping, at some point in our lives have been to a wedding and seen the joining of two beautiful people who are in love. And a wedding ritual, in its very basic sense, goes like this, regardless of the additional religious or spiritual trappings that are adorned on top of it. What we have are two people who start the ritual separately One is usually at the front of the aisle, and another one walks up to the front of the aisle. So they start out separately in the ritual. Music is often played, and there is an audience of people there to witness this, because this ritual does require witnesses. It's not a private ritual, it's a public ritual where you are announcing to the community your intention to become one with this other person. So once the two people arrive at the altar, that's where we see some of the nuances of what are important to that particular couple. This is where we will see sometimes the integration of religious practices or tradition, or spiritual practices or tradition. And whatever's done during that ritual is usually what's important to the couple. People in the audience, the witnesses, may be from a lot of different traditions, right? So they don't determine the ritual, the couple itself does, which is a very important thing that I'll talk about in a minute, so hang on to that in your mind. Once the ritual is ended, once they've done the stuff, let's say, then this couple walks away from the altar together. So this is important. They start separately, they do their practices, they say some vows usually, and then they walk away together. And this is the psychological shift. So we shift, all of us who are participating in this shift psychologically during this ritual, from seeing these two people as separate human beings to seeing these two people as joined as one. It is a shift of the unconscious, of the deep psyche. Those two people individually, before they begin the ritual, they know themselves as one, as individuals. And as they move through the ritual and then move out of it when it's finished, they then know themselves as a part of two. This is so important. You know, if you've ever spoken to someone who has been through the marriage process, most of them will say there is something different about marriage, right? I know many of my friends are like, oh, I don't need to get married. I don't need the piece of paper. But then other of my friends will say, yeah, but it does change things. There is something different about it. And so it's really critical. The whole audience witnessed this transition. They now know that these two people are one, essentially. They're moving as a unit. And the individuals know themselves as now moving as a unit. So this is a ritual I think we've all at least witnessed or have some context and seen in some way. So I wanted to bring it up as a good example of our talk today in this podcast. So all rituals will have similar pieces to this, right? The ritual contains 3 parts. Regardless of religious or spiritual tradition, a ritual from any tradition, when done correctly, will contain these 3 parts. First of all, is the pre liminal phase. This word liminal is important. It'll appear in all 3 phases. Liminal is that space in between, right? That space where you're not one thing, not another. You're something different, but you haven't yet transformed. It's like the butterfly inside of the cocoon. It used to be a caterpillar, but it's not a caterpillar anymore. And it's not yet a butterfly. It's something different. It's like a changeling inside that cocoon. That's the liminal space. So we have the pre-liminal period, which is where we are essentially getting ready for the ritual. We're preparing for it. We're psyching ourselves up. We're honoring it in some way. So things that happen in a preliminal period that are really common are perhaps we'll get dressed. So in the case of a wedding, we might put on a special outfit for the wedding. We might walk to the location. We might gather our friends, family, or tribe members. We might arrange specific items. There are things that we do to prepare, and this preparation helps start to give the memo to the psyche that change is afoot. This is what's really important about ritual. Ritual is the memo to the psyche that something is going to be different. If we don't give the psyche that memo, it doesn't actually know. The unconscious is unconscious. It doesn't know unless we pass the message back. So in order for us to move into new states of being, we have to pass the message back. And luckily, we can do these beautiful physical rituals to do that so that we can keep ushering ourselves into new phases of existence. So the preliminal period is the getting ready period. It's the moment as a yoga teacher that you arrive at the studio or walk through the door or plug in your music for the playlist or light the candles or incense in the room. It's how you research what you're going to do with your private client that day. It's how you read up on whatever inspiration you're going to provide to your students. That's the preliminal phase. And then the psyche is starting to get the memo that something's going to be different. Now, the ritual usually needs to begin with something momentous, with an event, with something that clues the psyche in to, okay, now we are officially in phase 2, which is the liminal period. So this is that in-between state where we're not yet the thing we will become and we're no longer the thing we were. So for us as yoga teachers and practitioners, often this is the chant of Om at the beginning of a class. This is very different from the rest of your day, right? I mean, the preliminal phase, maybe you wander into a class, you sit on your mat, you sit in cross-legged pose, maybe you even try to meditate for a minute and a half or something. That's still all preliminal. All of that stuff you could literally still do in the rest of your day. But when you chant Om with a group of people, that is a very clear demarcation that, okay, now class has begun. So as a spiritual leader, I want you to think about that. Are you properly ushering your students and clients into this ritual practice? Because I know that as a spiritual leader, what you endeavor to do with your clients is to transform them, is to usher them into new and greater states of being. But to do that, you must employ ritual. That's how you do this. That's what it takes. So is there a demarcation at the beginning of your work with a student or a client that they don't have to know it consciously, but unconsciously that now suddenly something is going to be different? So I often think of the chant of Om as a demarcating place where now the ritual has officially begun. In a wedding, since that's been our example today, it's often that people can be seated. Now suddenly we know something's beginning. We've seen these two people now come together, and the audience, the witnesses, can now sit down. And now we're going to get serious. We're going to do this stuff. So what goes into a liminal period is really important. So when we've participated in rituals within any kind of religious or spiritual tradition, it's very obvious that we're doing so. There's candles lit, there's chants done, there's ways that you shape your body. For example, you might have to pray on your knees and then stand up or in prostration. I've been to Bali, Indonesia quite a few times. It's one of my favorite places on the planet. And I've been very lucky to have befriended a local family, who has taken me with them on many different ritual traditions that the Balinese culture has. They have a very evolved and elaborate way of praying. And they have different flowers you have to use, and you have to put the different colors of the flowers behind one of your ears. You have to, sprinkle the incense and take the water in a certain way. It's very evolved and elaborate, and there are many rituals like this. Now, we also have, as yoga practitioners, a very evolved and elaborate ritual. We have these sun salutations, which are like prayers that we do with our body. We breathe in a certain way. We may even chant in a class. Perhaps we meditate. These are not normal everyday things. These are things that we do in the context of this ritual that are designed to usher us to this next phase of being. Now, we also must have an intention for the ritual. The ritual must have a purpose, right? What kind of thing are we trying to transform? In a wedding, we're trying to go from two separate people to two people who are a unit, a team. In a yoga class, it may be that we are trying to go from our stressful, normal, everyday lives to a more blissed out, relaxed, chilled out version of ourselves. So the ritual itself is going to need to contain things that help to bliss us out, chill us out, and relax. The most important thing to know about ritual, absolutely, unequivocally, if you take nothing else from this podcast, is that the ritual itself must contain elements that are powerful to the practitioner. If the practitioner finds no power in the elements of the ritual will have no effect. So, for example, even in a wedding, If the wedding is done in a language that one of the people getting married doesn't understand, or a tradition that one of the people is not from or doesn't have any connection to, if it contains elements that really mean nothing to one of the people, at the end of the ritual, they won't be married. They won't feel married. And this is important, especially when we have sometimes people from different backgrounds, different cultures. If one says, oh, we have to get married in this specific tradition, but it's not that other person's tradition, we could run into problems. It's the same thing with our spiritual leadership, our yoga classes. If the class doesn't mean anything, if it doesn't impart this ritualistic feel, if it doesn't include things that are powerful to the practitioners, then it's just exercise. So take your audience into context. Are these young college students? Are these people from suburbia? Are these largely parents? Are these busy professionals? What kinds of things will resonate with them specifically? If you've got college students, you're going to want to give them homework. If you've got busy professionals, you'll probably want to give them a little more of a rigorous practice to help get their energy out. Think about the people that you're working with this. And if you're working with people privately, if you're doing rituals privately with people, think of try to connect with them and actually ask them questions about what is important to them, what is meaningful for them, what helps them to understand transformation. Is it lighting a candle? Is it bathing in some way? Is it connecting with the earth? Is it connecting with a friend, right? Not everything that we do is going to be potent and powerful for everyone. So as a creator of ritual yourself, you really must take into account the context and the person, the individuals who are participating in this with you. Now, the end of the ritual, the third part, is called the Post Liminal Phase. So this is after the stuff has been done, and we're moving away from the ritual now, and we are now new people. We're different. So oftentimes there's something that signifies this end. At the end of a wedding, the couple kiss, and now we know they're conjoined, they're together. At the end of a yoga class, we'll often again Om, and that will signify that the ritual has ended. Rituals sometimes often have bookends like that, where we start with the same thing that we end with, maybe a prayer or a word. In the wedding ceremony, we often walk back down the aisle that we walked up in the beginning to get to the ritual. And so at the end of the ritual, this post-liminal phase, we want to close it out properly. We don't want to leave it open-ended. We want to have this demarcation point that says, okay, you are now done. This transformation is complete. An announcement of sorts that you are now this new, shiny version of the self that you once were before you began this ritual. So we can use rituals with these three different phases every day. And we can do little rituals every day. We can do a ritual for waking up, a ritual for starting the new day. And perhaps it's that you roll out of bed and you start the ritual by lighting a candle. And you do a little practice to honor the day, perhaps chanting the Gayatri mantra. And then you end the ritual by snuffing the candle, carefully putting things away and walking away. And that ushers you into a new day. You can do rituals for all sorts of things in life, and it's important that you do them because there are many things nowadays, especially in the evolution of our modern culture and society, that we are missing as because of a lack of ritual. If ritual ushers us from one phase of being to the next, and we don't get ushered, we don't go to that next phase of being. So some powerful examples to really bring this home for you are these. First, in this day and age, unfortunately, but statistically, 50% of marriages end in divorce. But we don't have a divorce ritual. So we have this powerful wedding that brings these people together, but nothing that makes them autonomous individuals again. So for these individuals who have been through a divorce, it is so important that you honor that phase of life, transition, through a ritual to give the memo back to the unconscious that we are once again autonomous individuals and that we have been officially, not just through paperwork, but spiritually speaking, emotionally speaking, psychologically speaking, fully separated from the individual that we were once married to. So you might want to share that with your friends if any of them have been through the condition of divorce, so that they make sure that they go through the ritual practice and separate themselves properly. So if you want to create a ritual for divorce, then you'll think of the 3 parts of ritual: the pre liminal phase, what might you bring into the ritual; the liminal phase, what might you do that would signify to you that this relationship is over? Perhaps it's burning something. Perhaps it's writing a letter. Perhaps it's doing some meditation or chanting. What would signify separation, and how can you represent that through an action or through something that you do physically in order to signify that separation, and then ending the ritual with a clear demarcation that it is now over and that you are now completely separated. Another very important ritual, so that's a ritual I don't think that we've ever had. The 50% divorce rate is very much a modern cultural phenomenon. But as we've moved away from our native religious and spiritual practices, one of the biggest and most important rituals that we've lost is the coming of age ritual. So the coming of age ritual has been something that has been a part of culture and tradition for humans in every place in the world throughout history. So, and we still have some of them. For example, in the Jewish tradition, there is the bar and bat mitzvah. In the Latin American tradition, there is the quinceañera. Those are the 2 I know off the top of my head. I know that there are others, but we don't have it as a cultural wide experience that everyone goes through some sort of coming of age ritual. This is really important because a coming of age ritual ushers you from childhood into adulthood. If you don't have one, if you never get that kick, that memo, if the psyche never really understands that you are now an adult responsible for yourself, what we end up with are a bunch of grown-up children. I don't know if you've ever known anybody like that, but it is something that occurs as a result of not having this very clear demarcation of psychological being. And it actually has very disastrous consequences, because what we say to young people when they go through this ritual, not only is that you are an adult now, but that we will also treat you and see you as an adult now. You have the responsibility of taking care of yourself, but we will also come to you for your input. We will rely on you for things. We will ask you for your participation in our community, in our tribe. And when we don't have that, children who are growing up, they struggle to get that, and they'll often try to struggle to get that sort of belonging and responsibility and respect in all the wrong ways. They'll get it from joining groups of people who seem to give it to them, but again, in all the wrong ways. Or they'll continually behave as children and ask to be continuously supported by their parents or family members. And you can see how either of these outcomes are quite detrimental for that individual. A coming of age ritual is so important for everyone. Now, some people naturally get it, and it doesn't excuse us from not having an actual ritual, but people will have a psychic kick into the next phase of being, into adulthood, in a couple of different ways. Females are often given that coming of age memo when they get their period at the onset of menses, because now suddenly their body is telling them, holy smokes, you can now be responsible for another human life. And that's often enough of a reality check to push young females into that mentality of adulthood. Sometimes not, but often it is. And for young people who have any kind of major trauma in the family, where they are asked to step up in the family unit and take on more responsibility, that also acts as a type of coming of age ritual. So there are still ways to get that kick, but let's be honest, wouldn't it be nicer if all of us had that affirmation from community, from family, from support members, that we are now adult, that we do now have this responsibility, that we are now going to be asked and tasked with taking care of our community members? I think it's such a beautiful way to bring these young people into the fold so that they now can have some agency in their life and direction in the community. One of my favorite coming of age rituals that I read about many years ago during my graduate studies it's a ritual of a Native American tradition where at the right time, the young person is brought out to nature with mom and dad behind them, and the community behind them as well. This is a witnessed ritual, so there's other people that are there to witness this occur. But essentially, the young person is asked to look at Father Sky and say, Father Sky, I now take you as my father, and I release my actual in-person father from the responsibility of fatherhood, adulthood. They've done a good job. They've raised me until now, but I am now an adult and I do no longer need that father person to support me, to discipline me, to raise me, to tell me where to go, what to do. I can do that for myself. And if I continue to need direction, I will look to you, Father Sky. And Mother Earth, I will look to you now for mothering. And my human mother, I release back to herself. She no longer needs to be mother. She's done a great job. She's raised me. She's nurtured me. She's given me food. She's protected me. She's provided for me. And she's done it for, a decade and a half. So she's good. She gets to now just be responsible for herself. I'm going to be responsible for myself as this young person. And if I find I need nurturing or support, then I will look to Mother Earth, not the human mother. Now, I think that this ritual is particularly definitive of what a coming of age ritual is meant to do. It is meant to release the parents of obligation from this child. As human animals, no animal on the planet spends as much time being raised by parents as humans do. Now, evolutionarily speaking, there's a lot of reasons for that. We have very big brains. Development is slow. It takes us until the age of 25, actually, until our brains are fully developed, which is wild. But if we continue to look for our parents for parenting long into our adulthood, we're missing the opportunity not just to be parent to ourselves, but to be full adults with agency and capacity, not just to raise ourselves, but to solve our own problems, to be responsible for ourselves. And it's not as if our parents are no longer in our lives. Of course they are. Of course we can still participate with them, ask them questions, even ask them for advice. Of course we can still love them. Of course we can still come to them with our problems. But we won't rely on them for that or need them for that. We will be able to handle our own problems if our parents are unavailable. We will be able to find our own sources of advice if our parents are unavailable. We can be responsible for ourselves. So, hopefully, these two examples illustrate the importance of ritual even for us in a modern day context, and that we as spiritual leaders, we are the providers of rituals for those modern day folks who don't necessarily have rituals of their own. And when we learn what is important to those individuals, we can craft rituals that help them to move from one phase of being to the other, to truly transform from the inside out, to give our psyche the memo that change is afoot and we can expand, empower, and manifest our most full capacity of being. So I hope that this illustration of ritual has been illuminating for you and that you start to think about what to include in your own daily rituals, big and small, as you usher yourself into new phases of being. If you want to talk more about this and learn more about ritual, I'm providing more teachings on this specific subject this month in my highereducation.yoga membership. So join me for a 2-week trial for only $1 by going to highereducation.yoga/trial, and you'll find a bunch of other members just like you who are working into expanding their roles as spiritual leaders. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review wherever you found this podcast, which helps other people find it too. And until the next podcast, namaste.